then about 25 to 30 years later, separate the events of Nebuchadnezzar with his insanity and the restoration of him to the events we're going to be seeing in chapter 5 of Belshazzar. And these are the kings that Daniel lived through. He started off with Nebuchadnezzar. Then the next one was Nebuchadnezzar's son. He was there for 2 years. Then, as you can read down, how the power changed. When it was Nebuchadnezzar, after he died, then the story goes through. His son took over. Then he was killed by his brother-in-law. Then that guy was killed in favor of someone, and so on and so forth, until we get to Belshazzar, who took over in 553. And he was the son of Nabonidus, which was the king above him. So from 562 to 533, or 553 is what, 9 years? We had 6 different kings take it over. Whereas Nebuchadnezzar reigned for, roughly, 40, 43, 45 years. Then in a small period of time, we had 6 kings take over. And in chapter 7, we're starting to pick up in the first year reign of Belshazzar in 553. Any questions about that? Test at the end of the year, so we won't have these slides up for then. But that's a brief recap, and a lot of this stuff is going to come into play, particularly about the statue, the gold statue with the bronze and all the different makings of it. That'll come into play as we start reading some of the things here in chapter 7. Let's start off with just verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and a vision in his mind as he lay on his bed. Then he wrote the dream down and related the following summary of it. Daniel's having a dream now. In all the events that we just talked about, Daniel had experienced, had interpreted dreams of kings. He went through all that. Now, after that, he is the one having this dream, and it's during the first year of Belshazzar's reign. So now we're seeing some of the events that had happened in chapter 5 and before that. So you can kind of get a feel of what Daniel was going through. He experienced some of these things that we heard about, the dreams and all that, but now he is the one that had this vision as he's laying on his bed. And at this time, when Belshazzar took over in 553, Daniel is about 66, 67 years old when he has this dream. He has a dream, and he writes it down as we read here. And now the fun stuff starts. I have to be honest with you. I probably read chapter 7 24 times. And I think I have a handle on it. So it's a tough one. And if you had an opportunity to read it, I hope you can make more sense out of it than I did the first time through, but it's interesting when you finally get a grasp of some of the meaning of it and you look back to some of the other stories in Daniel and throughout the rest of the Bible. It's a very interesting layout here of what's going to be happening in chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7, verses 2 through 8. Let's get into the meat of this story here. Daniel said, now this is about him talking about the vision that he had. I was looking in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And 4 great beasts were coming up from the sea, different one from another. The first was like a lion, it had wings of an eagle. I kept looking until its wings were plucked, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. A human mind also was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one resembling a bear. And it was raised up on one side, and 3 ribs were in its mouth between its teeth. And thus they said to it, Arise, devour much meat. Verse 6, After this I kept looking, and behold, another one, like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong. And it had large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And it was different from all the beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns. While I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were pulled out by its roots before it. And behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth uttering great boasts. Didn't understand it first time I read it. Didn't understand it second time I read it. Kept digging and looking and kind of understand it now. So we see in this dream here that Daniel's revealing to us in verse 2. He saw four winds of heaven stirring up the great sea. These four winds are representing the forces that God can use to control nations, the four great kingdoms. What are the kingdoms that we talked about? Nope. There the four kingdoms are. The Babylonian Empire was one of the first great kingdoms, which was Nebuchadnezzar. That's the time frame we're in right now with Belshazzar in rule. We know because of history and other events that we can read in the Bible, the next kingdom that's coming was the Medo-Persians. And we read that, I believe it was chapter 6. The second kingdom could be one of the second winds here that's talked about. The third one is the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great. And then finally the fourth one, the fourth empire, is the Roman Empire, and we know how long that was. And you can see the approximate dates that I found, and yes, there's overlap in the dates because when the Babylonian Empire fell, the Medes and Persians just didn't pop up at that time. They were in existence, but they weren't a powerful force at that time. And just like when you get down to Rome, you see, well, how can the Roman Empire be out there since 509, roughly? Well, they were starting. They're new at that point. When they really come into power was later on in their reign, and they were from 509 BC to approximately 476 AD. And we know during the time of Christ, that's when they were a very powerful empire at that time. So this is the time frame of that we're seeing happening here with Daniel and some of the things, and these four winds could be referring to, that they're used to control other nations, is when we have these big empires that are in charge, what do? They control the other nations and rule over them that are around them. If we look in Jeremiah chapter 49, verse 36, a reference to the four winds. It says, I will bring upon Elam the four winds from the four ends of heaven, and will scatter them to all these winds, and there will be no nation to which the outcasts of Elam will not go. So another reference to how these four winds, four nations, are controlling other things that control other nations that are in the world at that time. And at the end of chapter 2, it's talking about these four winds were stirring up a great sea. Initially, we think in that area there, what is the great sea that's over in Europe that we see? Obviously, people would think it's talking about the Mediterranean Sea. Mediterranean Sea, a large sea that's pretty much contained. They have high winds, rough seas at times, vicious storms that blow through there. So you think that it's referring to specifically the Mediterranean Sea at this point. But I don't believe that's the case, that the heavens were stirring up the great sea. I believe it's referring to what the great sea is the nations of the world. What? The nations of the world. Good so far? If anybody has some disagree, do one of this, let me know, because this is what I think it is. So, and I know there's a lot of interpretation that can happen here, and I might not have dug far enough. But the Great Sea is referring to the nations of the world, and by just reading the words here in Daniel 2, you're seeing that you can see a storm is brewing, but it's not a weather storm that's brewing here. It's a storm brewing because of the nations that are going to be happening. It's going to be kingdoms that are going to be overthrown. Kingdoms will rise, and another one's going to overthrow it and take over and be in charge at that point. So it is not a weather storm that we're seeing here in Daniel 2. It's about nations rising, nations conquering others, and then falling again. And if we look in Isaiah 57, verses 20 and 21, going for reference for the sea in that, but the wicked are like the tossing sea, for it cannot be quiet, and the waters toss up refuse and mud. There is no peace, says my God, for the wicked. So as we see this turmoil happening amongst these nations, God is still in charge. God is allowing these nations to rise. God is causing these nations to fall. These four winds, this great sea, which is the nations of the world, And these beasts are representing these 4 nations that we see up there. Any questions on this? Chapter 57, verses 20 and 21. Okay.
Before that, they had different kinds of calendars. Rome had their own. Rome was, the Roman calendar was called, abbreviation of AUC. I can't pronounce it. It's 3 Latin words. Ab, Urba, Cavita. Okay, that was theirs. And according to that calendar, Jesus was born in 753 AUC. In other words, 753 Roman time.
Okay.
753 would have been 753 our BC would have been when they considered the city of Rome established. So it was even earlier than the 500. They were an empire then, by no means, but that's what they claimed. The Romans claimed that they were established.
They were established, but not necessarily a force to be reckoned with. That's where I should have prefaced, these are rough dates, but it's kind of like when they start coming into power, and, you know, I couldn't find a definitive date for that, so I appreciate that. So it sounds like it was much earlier than the calendar of 509 BC that the Roman Empire existed as a nation. Terry.
The Romans also had their own legends where they didn't have any real history. They said Rome was founded by Romulus and Remus, who were brothers, but there's no record of them actually even living. So the 700 BC business, for the date of the establishment of Rome, was part of Rome's ancient history, which they didn't have real documentation for. And they were, for many of those centuries after that, a very small town in Italy that didn't conquer anybody at all. They were just their own little town. But then they got bigger and bigger, and, you know, as you said, they developed into a power. But it was over centuries and centuries that they developed into any kind of power, even inside Italy.
Yeah, that 753 AUC in the year of Rome is not when they were established as a nation. It was a city.
The city of Rome established. I mean, we look at compare that to the United States. When we consider the United States established. Okay, do we consider when we first came over? Do we consider it, you know, the 1776? But then again, we weren't 50 states. So as we grew, kind of like these other nations, you know, the Roman Empire and Greeks, they started off early. They weren't a force to be reckoned with, but they existed. And then slowly grew, and some came into power like the Greeks and the Romans. Great date input. I appreciate that. I didn't hear anything about, through the things I read about, what you were saying about that calendar. Maybe I saw the Greek words and just went right over them. If I can't read it and understand it, I'll pass. Anything else? Going on to verse 3, we see this turbulent sea. The 4 beasts came out of the sea, which, if we say that these 4 beasts are these powerful nations, and I say the sea is the nations of the world, these 4 nations, these powerhouses are coming out of the nations of the world, and they're different from one another. The Babylonian Empire was different from the Medo-Persians, which were also different from the Greeks, which were also different from the Romans. They all had their own type of government. They all had their own type of justice system that they had. They were all different from each other. And we're seeing that here as well.
Okay, you said something here that you haven't said before. Are you believing that in chapter 7, these 4 empires are the same 4 as in chapter 2?
Yes.
I agree with you, but, you know, it's different words.
Yes.
And some people disagree about that, but I think they are the same four empires that you have up there.
You said you think they are the same.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm agreeing with you.
I agree also.
Well, I got it from the two corners of the room, so. When I went into this, great advice from Ted. To look at it with an open mind and see what the words say and listen to it. A lot of people, when they start reading this and they read the word beasts, they automatically go to Revelation and think the end of time, the beast that's coming at that point. This is not that. I want to stop that right now. This is not that. So if we can, I had the trouble of keep thinking that and looking through it, but once I realized, take that out of it and see what this says and do the study. This is not the beast that we can read about in Revelation. The beasts here are referring to these four empires that were going to happen at the time here. Terry.
Completely agree with you, but to expand just a little bit. There are lots of churches that are teaching exactly what you just said and teaching it wrong. They're wanting to say that Daniel is a history from his times and the end of the world. They're wanting to say that Daniel in chapter 2 and in chapter 7 are talking about things today and the future from today. And that's not correct. And if you meet people of this persuasion, they will want to immediately talk to you about Daniel and tell you that here's God saying way back in the Old Testament times, the history of the world and the end of time, and that's not correct.
Some of the things Daniel's saying here are things that are in the future, but not this far, because the Greeks weren't in charge yet. The Romans weren't in charge yet, but that is going to be coming down the road. Ted.
Two things, I'm not saying anything different, I 100% agree so far with you and Gary, and I know I will probably to the end of this class. But to put it a different way, the people that describe the beasts nowadays in Revelation are most often wrong also. Which is the reason why they misinterpret, one of the reasons why they misinterpret Daniel. Secondly, Daniel is not ever predicting the end of the world. He is predictive of who?
Christ.
Jesus. And that's the whole point of these, is to tell when Jesus was coming. And it's the very reason why the Magi knew, and the very reason why those two, one old guy and one old woman at the beginning of the Gospels that were looking for the Christ, they knew because they were looking at places like this in Daniel, and they knew it was the right time. They are predictive of Jesus, not of the end of the world.
Yes. Hope I kind of made that clear to get through this so you're not thinking about the end of the world at that point. Any questions on this? Because there's some smart people here that can answer these questions. Yeah, there
Some
are.
of this stuff is still hard.
See, that's what paranoids me. When Ted has told me that several times, some of it's hard for him, I'm thinking, what am I doing teaching this? So,
You're getting into the tough parts
th-
now.
this,
4-7, it's easy.
yeah.
Let me tell you something. I've never taught Daniel. There's a reason.
And why didn't you talk me out of it?
I tried at the very beginning. Oh, well.
Well, are you sure is not really trying, Ted. So, but I hope I do this Daniel justice, and if I am wrong, please correct me, but it's a tough book, but I think it's one we definitely need to read through more than just, like I said, more than just a fiery furnace and the lion's den, which to me, that's all Daniel was. And it's, I appreciate that. But Daniel is much, much more than, like I said, the fiery furnace and the lion's den. Yes, we can learn great things from the faithfulness of those four men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel. We can learn tremendous amounts through the first 6 chapters. But I think chapters 7 through 12 can really help us grow as Christians to see things in a different light here. So we got these 4 beasts coming up. They're different from one each other, and we know there's turmoil happening. And in verse 4, we start getting descriptions of these beasts. And the first one's like a lion, and it had wings of an eagle. And I don't know if I went too far. That's the last one. Whoa. What did I do, Aaron? I need to go back. See, no, Brett, I'm no longer pointing at you, I'm pointing at Aaron. You did a much better job. One more back. Perfect. This is in comparison of the dream in Daniel 2, which Nebuchadnezzar had, which we see on the left, the head of gold, the chest, and the belly and that, the empire in the middle, and now the vision here in chapter 7, the comparison of who's who, what's what. And as we're getting into the line, we can see this is representing the statue, the head of gold, which is the Babylon Empire here. And it's interesting that when you hear lion, what do you think of? King of beasts, something fearful, something powerful. And the Babylonian Empire grew into a fierce empire there. And it's not uncommon for back in the olden days, you know, the time of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar, and even after that, that they would have statues of odd items, like a lion with wings or other type of things. And we believe that the wings here as this kingdom that came into power so fearful, the wings of an eagle. What do you think of an eagle? Fly fast, fly hard. And the Babylonian Empire, once they came into power, they grew pretty fast. And that's one of the things that these wings are representative of. And then we go on to read, after we see this powerful nation and it came up fast, its wings were plucked. Well, what happened to the Babylonian Empire? What happened to Nebuchadnezzar? He fell. Remember how he lost his sanity and he was out of pocket. He had lost power. And then we go on to finish reading verse 4. And he was made to stand on 2 feet again, and given a human mind was also given to it. Nebuchadnezzar came back into power. And it was told that would happen to him once he realized the mistake that he made and that he recognized who God was and the power that he had came from God. Nebuchadnezzar came back into power for a short period of time. And we read that, you know, it says here, and a human mind was also given to him. And what happened to Nebuchadnezzar? He came back into a right frame of mind there when he took back over his power. In comparison to some of these beasts that we're reading here in chapter 7, I want to go back to Hosea chapter 13. This is talking about Ephraim's idolatry. I'm only making a comparison of animals here, not the story. So I will be like a lion to them. Like a leopard, I will lie in wait by the wayside. I will encounter them like a bear robbed of her cubs. I will tear open their chests. I will also devour them like a lioness, as a wild beast would tear them. The beasts we're reading about in chapter 7 here in Daniel are nations conquering, overtaking other nations. And we're seeing the same reference to the same type of animals happening, doing pretty much the same thing here in Hosea. So the reference of an animal being representing a nation doing things is not uncommon for that to be referred to. Any questions about the first beast? No, nothing special about a lion with wings. We understand kind of how it represents the Babylonian Empire, how it came into power fast and slowly lost its power. Yes, Terry.
I'm agreeing with you. I'm agreeing with everything you're saying. The end is saying, stand on 2 feet like a man with a human mind. I've got a little note by this word mind here literally is heart. And is it possible that as part of saying that Nebuchadnezzar, got back into power, but maybe was more moderate at that time, that he was not as brutal as he had been when he was earlier in him being king, that he had a better heart?
That could be.
That's just an idea.
It's interesting. This was my verse 3 notes that I was talking about chapter 4. And at the end of my chapter 4 notes, the Aramaic translation of the word mind could also mean heart. Yeah. And I got reference not to the way you were thinking of it, But after Nebuchadnezzar, I got written down, the Babylonians lost heart after Nebuchadnezzar died. I mean, it could be another way of thinking it. Because he was in power for 40 plus years, that he took care of them. He kept under things, things under his thumb, things in control. Then in a short span of 10 years roughly, there were 6 more kings. One was killed by his brother-in-law. Another one was killed so somebody else could be in power. So there's a change of power there. And as a nation, that could be disheartening to the people as well. So what you were saying that Nebuchadnezzar had a change heart? Yes, he did.
Babylon was getting weaker after Nebuchadnezzar died.
Yes.
And Belshazzar is when it...
He was the last one of the
he was
Babylonian Empire.
One of the worst ones, but he was around longer. He did more damage.
He was around longer than the 5 before him.
Right.
Yes, yes. Anything on verse 4 about the lion and reference to this? Does it make sense in the comparison to the statute that Nebuchadnezzar saw with the interpretation of that dream to what's going on here in the vision that Daniel had here in verse 7? It's going to kind of all come together by the time we get to verse 8 or 9 in chapter 7 here. Let's go on to verse 5, talk about the second beast. We see a second one was a bear with resembling a bear, and it was raised up on one side, and it had 3 ribs on its mouth between its teeth, and it said to arise, devour much meat. Has anybody ever seen a stuffed bear at some place? They've got them big standing up. Have you ever seen one like it's one leg up? How it kind of seems more powerful that way? The picture of this bear being raised up on one side, the significance of it is this bear is representing the Medo-Persians. And when you have 2 nations that are together, that like conquer the Babylonians, one of them is going to be more powerful than the other. One of them is going to have more influence. And this bear being raised up, at that time, the Persians were a much more powerful influence and empire than the Medes were. So this bear being raised up on one side is representing that the superior blend of these 2 cultures between the Medes and Persians is made up by the Persians at that point. So it's representing that one of these 2 nations is a little more powerful than the other. And then the 3 ribs that are in the bear's mouth, they're representing the conquest that these Medes and Persians had. So not only did they take over the Babylonians, they also conquered Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt. And we know they conquered Babylon in 539. And I don't have anything up there for this. They conquered Lydia in 546. Then they conquered Babylon in 539. Then they went over and got Egypt in 525. So you can see the Medes and Persians, they kept growing as they were in power there. So they just didn't conquer Babylon. They conquered Lydia first, and after Babylon, a few years later, they went down and conquered Egypt. So those 3 ribs that are in the lion's teeth could be representing these other 3 powerhouses that the Medes and Persians conquered. And verse 5 is saying, and they said to it, arise, devour much meat. That's what the Medes and Persians did. They kept going off there and they kept conquering things. And at the end of verse 5 it says, and thus they said to it. We don't know who the they are that did the saying. Daniel may have seen angels in a vision, but there's no evidence of that. We don't know who was saying to that bear, arise and devour much meat. But we know that God is in control. We know that he rises nations to conquer other nations, to punish his people. This could very well be angels talking to the bear about rise and devour much meat. But there is nothing here that implies it, that says it. All Daniel says here is, and thus they said to it, arise, devour much meat. So there's a lot of inferring here on our part, my part, as reading this. Could it be angels? Could it not be angels? I'm interested in anybody's input of what they think, who or what is saying the they.
Of these 4, history kind of tells us that the Medes and Persians, especially the Persians later on that took over, were the nastiest of these 4 empires. They were nasty people. In fact,
About the Persians.
about Persia. And even nowadays, and I didn't know this till I just was looking something up and noticed it by accident, a lot of the video games that are made nowadays that have the nasty people that do all the fighting, they're actually depicted on there as Persians for that reason.
I can attest to that because I play those video games. They do. They refer to them quite often as, yes. When you get to select the characteristic, they're mean and nasty. They got weapons to destroy other things. I mean, that's a completely different thing. But yes, they are depicted that way.
That's what they're saying is most likely that's not thought of in modern times. That's coming from the Greek writings and things from the past. What the people were like.
I mean, that's where we see not just things in the Bible, but other histories that come to that.
Which my point almost forgot was that with ribs in the mouth, that might be part of what they're talking about, how nasty those people.
Feasting on the bare bones that are left of the empires that they devoured. Anything else? Let's continue on. So we got through the first two beasts. Verse 6, we're going to be talking about the third one. And as Daniel kept looking, behold, another one like a leopard, which had on its backs 4 wings of a bird. Now remember, the first one that we saw, the lion, it was specific about the wings. It had the wings of an eagle, but this is just saying here in verse 6, 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. And, the fourth one, or the third one here, referring to the Greek Empire here. Now the wings again are representing speed, how just like the first empire referring to the Babylonians came into power real fast and did a lot of things. 4 wings may represent that they did it even with a greater speed than what happened with the first one. Because within a very short period of time, Alexander the Great, he conquered a sizable portion of the nations over there all the way from Greece over to India. And he did that in a period of about 3 or 4 years, from 334 to 331. So he conquered a lot of territory in a short period of time. And now we're getting into talking about, so we see the leopard with the wings, how this happened at a fast time. Now this beast has 4 heads.
Just a minute.
I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand. No, it's...
I want to make sure people understand those dates. That's 13 years. From the first day to the second day.
Yes.
3,000 miles he conquered in 13 years.
3 years. 334 to 331 is what I got, is what I found.
I think that might be when he ruled. But it says here,
I got his entire campaign lasted 12 years, but that initial happened real fast, is what I found.
okay, maybe that's true.
I don't know.
I think the 3 years starts when he conquered Babylon, and it was 3 years that he was wandering around east of Babylon, down in toward India, and then back up, and then he died. He actually dies at the end of that 3 years.
Now,
Okay?
think about this, though. The United States is roughly 3,000 miles across. He conquered that much territory without modern weapons in an extremely short period of time. That's why he's a leopard.
He's the leopard with the 4 wings for the speed that he did that.
And the only reason he didn't hold on to that territory and others took over for him was he got so drunk and died.
I just used the words his untimely death. I was being nice. But yeah, it's no telling how far the Greek Empire would have went if Alexander the Great hadn't died that young, that early.
You know why he didn't get further? His own troops rebelled against him. They knew they were 3,000 miles from home, and they were sick and tired of fighting all these years. Just, a lot of these people had been fighting for 12 years, okay? And they were saying, we're not gonna go any further. And he would get out and talk to them and encourage them to keep on going for a while. And they were still willing to stay with him. The other thing to remember about this army is that after he got to Babylon, he the army was only about 40,000 men. This is conquering a massive amount of territory with really a very small army. And to show how good that army was, when he was up against the Medes and the Persians, they only had 100,000 people on the field against him. And 40,000 beat 100,000. He wasn't just, that's why I call him great. Not only did he do it fast, he was astonishingly great in his military tactics. He could take a small group like that and train them so very, very well to where they could conquer an army much larger than they were and do it fast.
Which is what we see at this point. Yes, Ted?
By this time, the Septuagint had been the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And one of the amazing things was Alexander the Great had read this and knew that these scriptures in Daniel, when it came to these parts,
Yeah.
was talking about himself. And he distributed those Greek Old Testaments, those Septuagints, around the empire as he conquered it.
Okay.
Which is probably the reason why the Magi was able to read it in the East before they came back to Jesus' time, because it had been planted there 300 years earlier.
The story was there.
So he had a purpose.
Great comment. Anything else before we finish the verse?
We're almost done with the class. There's one more thing. I don't know if you're gonna talk about the four heads some more.
I was going to.
Go ahead, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I'll see if I match you.
Tell me if I'm wrong, okay? When Alexander died, he had three generals that took over his empire after he died. He was one, they were three. And they formed three small empires that lasted until the Romans came in. I'm thinking that that's what it means by the four heads.
I actually read and deciphered that the four heads were four different rulers, or,
You got four after he died?
yes.
That could be true.
Macedon and Greece were under the rulers from Alexander of Antipater and Cassander. And then Western Asia was under Lysimachus. Syria and Persia was under Seculus I, and Egypt under was Ptolemy II.
Then you got
It doesn't mean I'm right, but that's what I found, how it referred to the four. And because Alexander was out of the picture, this is what was left, and that's why I think it was that versus him being one and three others.
See, it's not just Alexander. These groups, these empires went on for a long
Yes.
time after Alexander died, and this verse is talking about the whole time.
The whole
that
time.
empire in existence.
So
Yeah.
we're both half right. We're going to stop at chapter 6, number 1, because of time. So, but any questions about what we got here? We'll pick this back up, and we'll get into the fourth beast after this, and then things really start going sideways if we don't keep our heads on straight. Thanks for being here. Whoa, wrong one. I didn't have that. Sorry, Aaron. I'll just put that away.